ASEAN wasn't started as an organization. It was started as a pragmatic measure to create trust amongst countries that had been at war with one another. In 1967, when ASEAN was founded, Indonesia had just ended its confrontation with Malaysia and Singapore. Singapore had just been ejected from the Federation of Malaysia. The Philippines had a claim to Sabah, and in the north, the Vietnam War was raging. So it was essential back then, more than 50 years ago, to create this idea that there was an association, a community of nations. ASEAN developed very pragmatically. It didn't have a constitution. The Bangkok Declaration wasn't even meant to be a treaty. The Bangkok Declaration, which founded ASEAN, basically set up a mechanism for the foreign ministers to meet. And from those modest beginnings, ASEAN started to grow. The main impetus for ASEAN's growth over the last half-century was, firstly, the fear of communist expansion because of the Vietnam War, especially after the fall of South Vietnam in 1975. Secondly, after the resolution of the Vietnam War, it was economics. Vietnam became a member of ASEAN in the 1990s. It was followed shortly by Myanmar, Laos, and finally Cambodia, which rounded up the membership of ASEAN, except for Timor-Leste. After the end of the Vietnam War, the glue that held ASEAN together was economic progress, because the whole of ASEAN consists of 600 million people, a gigantic market if it can get together. The problem was that because of the way ASEAN had developed, there was no formal structure. Things had developed almost on the fly. Ministers would meet, they would issue a declaration, they would issue a statement of some sort, and the institutions developed from that. So by the beginning of the 21st century, it was felt by the leaders of ASEAN that it was necessary to formalize the structure, to create, in effect, a framework for ASEAN cooperation. ASEAN's ambition is to become a community of 600 million people. This community consists of three pillars: the ASEAN Economic Community, the ASEAN Political Security Community, and the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community. All of this is supposed to happen by 2015, this year. But back at the beginning of the 21st century, there was no framework for this, no legal framework for this. Hence the push to have a formal agreement, which became the ASEAN Charter. The ASEAN Charter was signed in 2007, it's 8 years ago now almost. It was the results of the reports of an eminent persons group, which consisted of one member from each of the ASEAN member countries. The eminent persons group identified two major shortcomings in ASEAN. Firstly, the organization was very good at putting out statements and declarations, but not so good at following these up. It almost seems as if when the summit was held, the main aim was to have some sort of declaration rather than to have concrete action. And that was a major shortcoming. This is something that Secretaries General have identified over and over again. The second major shortcoming was that there was no means of settling disputes amongst ASEAN members. Now, if you want to be a rules-based community, which is the stated ambition of ASEAN in the Charter, you need to have a means of settling disputes. You can't let disputes drag on forever. The old strategy of ignoring the dispute, hoping that it would go away, just doesn't work, especially if you want to create an ASEAN economic community. And this is, as I said, the major driving force now for ASEAN as an organization. When we were tasked with drafting the Charter, the grand visions of the eminent persons group had to be reduced to hard language. And I was a member of that high-level task force which drafted it. So what came out of the drafting process is not an ideal document. It is a compromise amongst the aims of 10 very different members. And the ASEAN Charter creates that framework for the ASEAN community. It creates a mechanism for monitoring. It creates dispute settlement mechanisms. I should say that these mechanisms of monitoring as well as dispute settlement are not perfect. In fact, if you read them and you see how they work in practice, one would say they are flawed. But they are a basis on which we can work. How is ASEAN going to achieve its ambition to create that community based on rule of law, the community that follows the rules? You need to have some sort of legal underpinning. It is impossible to create a rules-based community without that legal underpinning. The ASEAN Secretariat is the only neutral central organization that ASEAN has. How would we set this up? It would have to be part of the ASEAN Secretariat. Ideally, it should be headed by a Deputy Secretary General in order to give it that heft and clout necessary for it to work. It should be recruited from amongst the best, not national quotas, because national quotas is an invitation to mediocrity. We should be open to having people from outside ASEAN, because misplaced nationalism is an enemy to competence. You should pay the legal service competitively. Do not expect people to give up their jobs in Singapore or Kuala Lumpur or Manila to come to Jakarta to work for less than market rates. This is totally unrealistic. And above all, it must be clear to the member states that the legal service is independent and should not be influenced. And this is probably the most important element of all, that the member states should recognize that the legal service is for the benefit of ASEAN as a whole. They should not try to influence their nationals in the legal service, and they should not try to impose their will on the legal service. Can it be done? The answer is only if the political leaders have the will to do it. ASEAN is an institution that is powered by a mixture of idealism and hot air. And very often the hot air takes precedence. People make these wonderful declarations about having a rules-based organization, following the rule of law. This is the time to show that they are serious about it by creating a proper legal service at the center to support the Secretary General, to support the summit, to support the ASEAN organs, and to demonstrate to ASEAN citizens and to the world that we are serious about creating the ASEAN community.